Imagine a world without computers. No smartphones, no internet, no artificial intelligence. A world where electricity never revolutionized industries and where innovation was silenced before it could change history. Some of the greatest minds who shaped our modern world paid a heavy price for their brilliance. They weren't just geniuses. They were outcasts, misunderstood, betrayed, and, in some cases, erased from history. This is the tragic story of three of the world's greatest innovators, brilliant minds who gave us everything but lost it all. When you charge your phone, switch on the lights, or use the freezer, you have Nikola Tesla to credit. On January 7, 1943, a servant working at the New Yorker hotel entered room 3327, where she found the corpse of an 86-year-old man who called the hotel home for the last decade. Tesla passed away lonely and poor. He lived on a diet of hot milk and biscuits and was obsessed with feeding the birds outside. One of the greatest creators of all eras faded into neglect and died broke. There's a cause why this happened, which will become clear by the end of this tale. Tesla was born in the village of Smiljan in present-day Croatia on July 10, 1856. He was born during a thunderstorm. According to family myth, the midwife said halfway through the birth, "This child will be a child of shadow," to which his mother replied, "No, he will be a child of light." Little did she know how prophetic those words would be. When Tesla was 5, he saw his elder brother fall from a horse and later die. This would haunt him for the rest of his days. As a child, he began having visions, along with flashes of light, confusing what was real and what was imaginary. This never faded. The visions spurred his ability to imagine creations in his mind in such detail that he didn't even need to sketch them. He described how the designs were perfected in his mind in an article in 1919. "Invariably, my device works as I conceived that it should, and the experiment comes out exactly as I planned it. In 20 years, there hasn't been a single exception." Tesla credits his mother for his passion for creation. Yuka Mandik crafted small home gadgets in her spare time. She had a photographic memory, the skill to recall an image from memory with sharp accuracy, and she passed this on to her child. Tesla's father was a clergyman and wanted him to become one too. But Tesla was interested in mechanics when he contracted cholera as a teen and nearly died. His father promised to send him to technical school if he survived, and miraculously, he did. He went to study in Austria at the Technical School of Graz, where he is said to have worked from 3 a.m. until 11 p.m. every day. Teachers were worried that he would die from fatigue. Tesla had a brilliant mind. He could solve calculus in his head and spoke 8 tongues. He was a good student at first, but would not complete school. He left after becoming addicted to betting and cut ties with his relatives so they wouldn't find out. His friends didn't know what became of him either. They thought he drowned in a river. Tesla moved around Europe and eventually ended up in Budapest, working as an electrician at a telephone company. While walking around a park in the city one day, he had an insight about creating a new way of producing electricity using alternating current. It would be his greatest creation that would change the planet. I will explain more about AC later. In 1882, he settled in Paris to work for the French office of Thomas Edison's electric firm. He started off installing indoor lamps, but the managers noticed his skills and had him doing more advanced work, designing and building generators and engines. He was soon traveling across Europe, fixing issues at other Edison branches. 2 years later, in 1884, Tesla's manager offered him a role at Edison Machine Works in New York City. He agreed and arrived in America with only 4 cents in his pocket because his money was stolen on the ship ride over. Tesla initially had a positive impression of Edison. Edison was also impressed by Tesla, later saying, "I've had many diligent assistants, but you surpassed them all." This mutual respect didn't last. They would become fierce rivals. The two men disagreed over how electricity should be controlled and supplied. Edison preferred direct current, which is a system where the electric charge only moves in one direction. Tesla was a fan of alternating current, in which the electric charge shifts direction regularly. Shifting directions is vital to keeping a stable flow of electricity because it doesn't overload sockets. This means it can deliver more energy and carry power across greater distances. It's the reason AC supplies our houses and other big devices, while DC powers smaller gadgets like torches. But Edison wasn't concerned about AC because it could have affected the profits of direct currents since he held all the rights for DC. According to Tesla, a supervisor at Edison's firm promised him a $50,000 reward if he could enhance some devices that operated on DC. When he did, the supervisor declined to pay. Another version of the tale has Edison telling Tesla, "You don't get our American jokes, no matter how it unfolded." Tesla resigned and set out to create his own electric firm the next year in 1885. But his backers showed little enthusiasm and chose to seize the company and all of Tesla's rights, which they could do because Tesla had given the rights to the company in return for shares, which were now useless. After losing his company, Tesla had to find work digging trenches for $2 a day just to live. But his luck would shift. In 1887, Tesla created an induction engine that worked on alternating current. The engine was the most effective method to change electricity into mechanical force. A model of it powers Tesla's cars, which got their name from the inventor. He patented the engine and displayed it the next year at the American Institute of Electrical Engineers. That drew the interest of George Westinghouse, a key figure in the electric industry who saw Tesla's AC engine might be exactly what he needed to finish his alternating current setup and compete with Edison's DC system. So Tesla leased the rights for the AC engine to Westinghouse for $60,000 and also got shares in payments. Westinghouse employed him as an advisor for $2,000 monthly, which equals over $50,000 monthly today. The battle of the currents started. Edison worked hard to ruin Westinghouse and Tesla's reputation. He quietly funded the electric chair that used alternating current to show how risky AC was. Edison's firm also publicly harmed animals to prove its claim. In 1903, they electrocuted a circus elephant named Topsy and made a film about it called Electrocuting an Elephant. Despite Edison's tricks, positive things were happening for Westinghouse and Tesla. They outbid Edison and his new firm, General Electric, to light up the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. The first fully electric fair honored the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in America. It was obvious to the 27 million people who came that AC would power the future. Their victory continued when they defeated Edison's General Electric again to construct the world's first alternating current power station in Niagara Falls. The water-powered energy plant was a huge success and helped brighten Buffalo, New York. The construction of the plant also made Tesla a trailblazer in sustainable energy. His monument can be seen at Niagara Falls today. Westinghouse and Tesla triumphed in the battle of the currents, and direct current was being phased out. But there were issues. Westinghouse's firm was running low on funds and eventually fell $10 million into debt. In 1897, he approached Tesla and requested if his payments could be lowered in a desperate effort to rescue the firm. Tesla was so moved by sympathy for his friend that he tore up his agreement. He was thankful to Westinghouse for having faith in him when no one else did. Tesla willingly gave up $12 million in payments, which in today's value would be over $300 million. Had he kept those payments over time, he would have likely become the richest person on Earth and the first person with $1 billion fortune. That act of kindness for his friend, of ripping up his agreement, saved Westinghouse. In return, Westinghouse gave Tesla $216,000 for the rights to use his AC licenses forever. This equals about $6 million today. With that money, Tesla became financially stable and set up a number of labs in New York for fresh projects where he was visited by the wealthy and famous, including his close friend and one of the greatest American authors of all time, Mark Twain. This was his era of many creations. He held over 300 licenses in his lifetime. He designed an early form of neon lights, the Tesla turbine, a bladeless engine for cars. He advanced X-ray science by experimenting with radiation. This is an X-ray of his own palm. Another notable creation was one of the earliest remote controls. In 1898, he operated a small boat at Madison Square Garden in New York. It was so ahead of its era that the audience thought he was using magic to make it move. That would be the predecessor to today's remote-controlled drones. One of his most famous creations is the Tesla coil, a tool that can generate huge amounts of high-voltage power. Thanks to the coils, he found he could transmit and receive strong radio signals when they matched at the same frequency. Tesla was preparing to send his first radio signal, but tragedy hit. A blaze ruined his lab in 1895. He lost years of studies and tools. Tesla didn't file for a license for the radio until 2 years later. The fire would be the turning point in his life that led to a downward decline. At the same time that he was working on radio, an Italian businessman, Guglielmo Marconi, was also developing the radio in Britain. He tried to secure license rights in the US but was rejected because it was too similar to Tesla's. However, things shifted when Marconi managed to send the world's first transatlantic radio signal in 1901, using 17 of Tesla's licenses. Edison then provided his financial backing to Marconi. Tesla had no issue with Marconi's success, but in 1904, the US Patent Office suddenly reversed its decision and granted Marconi a license for the creation of the radio. There has never been an explanation for this choice, but the strong financial support Marconi received might explain it. Marconi went on to earn the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1911, which was only possible because of Tesla's efforts. Tesla was enraged and filed a lawsuit against Marconi. The case dragged on in court for years and was only resolved in Tesla's favor after his death. That radio event badly affected the rest of Tesla's profession. For instance, Tesla was fixated on introducing wireless communication to the globe and constructed a massive wireless broadcasting tower in Long Island, New York called Wardenclyffe Tower. He envisioned a world where we could send and get messages without wires. He was, once more, far ahead of his era. But financial supporters didn't have enough confidence in his plan. They withdrew and invested in Marconi's radio creation instead. This left Tesla in economic disaster. He had no option but to give up his dream venture in 1905 and eventually lost Wardenclyffe Tower to repossession. Tesla's mental well-being worsened. He spent his final decade in the New Yorker hotel starting in 1933. Westinghouse Company employed him as an advisor and covered his lodging. He lived without paying rent but passed away owing money. So why did one of the greatest creators of all time disappear into neglect and die broke? You could argue Tesla was unfortunate at times, like when the blaze destroyed his New York workshop. But the main cause is that Tesla wasn't a businessman. He made choices that people with stronger financial sense wouldn't have made, like giving up his payments for the AC engine. He wasn't focused on wealth. He cared about the quest for knowledge for the good of humanity. He aimed to transform the world. And he did. Thanks partly to Elon Musk's firm, people are beginning to discover more about the man who influenced the company, a man whose creations would energize our whole world. It's because of Tesla that today's society operates the way it does. Tesla's mother described him as a child of light, and she was absolutely correct. In 1941, the British battled with Nazi Germany on the vast waters of the Atlantic, and were failing. Essential supplies sent from the United States to the UK and later the Soviet Union were being destroyed at an unbearable pace. The Royal Navy had the weapons to defeat the Kriegsmarine, but simply didn't know when and where the German Navy would attack. Interceptions of German messages completely confused code decoders at the moment. There seemed to be no pattern or logic to any of the codes they received. And even if some progress was thought to have been made, the very next day, their efforts were strangely made useless. This was because of the Germans' special coding system, designed shortly after the First World War by Arthur Scherbius. The code was produced by a device called the Enigma and used publicly by banks, companies, and civilians throughout the 1920s and 1930s to send highly secure messages. The Polish cryptonola Kisnia had already cracked the device once before in 1938. But the improved version used by the German army made their decoding devices ineffective. At the start of the war, the British government gathered an expert group of code decoders and stationed them in the countryside estate of Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire. Their only mission: break as many security codes as they could. Among them was a 27-year-old man from Manchester, Alan Matheson Turing. A part-time code decoder at the government's Code Decryption and Cipher School, the forerunner to GCHQ, Turing was appointed head of Hut 8, a group in charge of cracking the Enigma. The hours were long, the schedules were irregular, and they achieved very little success. That was until the 9th of May 1941, when the crew of the HMS Bulldog seized the German submarine U-110 and captured the Enigma machine along with its code manuals. The items were delivered to Bletchley Park and examined by the team. What they discovered was quite fascinating. Inside, they uncovered a basic circuit board and 3 changeable rotors, each with numbers around the edges, a set of keys and lights with the input and output system. Every time a key was pressed, a rotor would shift one spot and a letter would light up on the board above. This was the encrypted letter. Unlike a traditional Caesar cipher, letters would often trigger a different light each time. The letter C might not always light up the letter G, and the letter J might light up from pressing 2 different keys. The encoder had to choose 3 out of 5 rotors to place into the device, followed by 26 distinct starting points for each rotor. Besides this, there were 10 wiring board plugs that could be arranged in over 150 trillion different patterns. So how many possible ways could the Enigma machine be configured? 158 quintillion, 962 quadrillion, 555 trillion, 217 billion, 826 million, 360,000. Each German radio operator received a monthly guide on what the Enigma's settings would be for each day, and these manuals were written with dissolvable ink so they could be quickly destroyed if a ship was boarded. If you wanted to decode each message without seizing a ship for that month's codebook, you'd have to break the code entirely. Good luck with that. The Germans truly believed they had built an uncrackable cipher, and you'd be forgiven for thinking there's absolutely no chance to solve a code with over 158 quintillion possible outcomes. But of course there was. Turing's team discovered one critical weakness in the Enigma machine. One tiny flaw that made the entire system completely vulnerable. A glitch in the wiring missed during its development that would fully break any and all German messages. Any letter, when passed through the encryption device, would never result in the same letter lighting up on the display board. And that means you can rearrange the plug board and rotors, press every key, and then find the only letter that doesn't light up when you press the same key repeatedly. That's your decoded letter. Of course, with 158 quintillion configuration possibilities, this is an incredibly slow task to perform manually. So, using some electronics and a bit of mechanics, Turing created a machine that could mimic multiple Enigma settings simultaneously. All the code breakers needed to do was enter the final 2 words of any German message, which would always be a scrambled version of the words Heil Hitler. The device would then cycle through every Enigma configuration until it identified one that generated this phrase. The setup that produced Heil Hitler would be the configuration to adjust the Enigma machine to, and then one could begin decoding whatever the remainder of the message was. Thanks to this device, the entire procedure of breaking a code shifted from taking millions of years to around 20 minutes. Turing named the machine the bomb after the devices the Poles had been using to decipher the German Army and Air Force codes. Most importantly, this version of the bomb could also decrypt naval messages. With their cipher compromised, the Germans had nowhere to hide. Any message about troop deployments, covert agents, or military strategies intercepted by the Allies would be decoded, and Allied forces would be prepared for any assault. The British also corrected the weakness in the Enigma and began using it themselves, a cryptographic technique that remains unbreakable even today. The Battle of the Atlantic was won, and the Nazi Empire collapsed shortly afterward, now that the shipping routes were secure. Experts generally agree that the cracking of the code reduced the duration of World War II by 2 years, preserving an estimated 14 million lives. All thanks to one individual, Turing, for inventing the bomb, solving the code, and developing several other code-breaking machines, was honored with the Order of the British Empire and chosen as a Fellow of the Royal Society 5 years later. Today, Turing is celebrated as the pioneer of modern computing and artificial intelligence. His contributions to computing not only saved the world from oppressive fascism, but also laid the foundation for the digital technology we rely on today. You probably wouldn't be watching this video right now without his achievements. However, this remarkable influence wasn't fully acknowledged back then. The The official State Secrets Act stopped anyone from learning about the true scope of Turing's efforts, and Turing received no special recognition from the public regarding revelations about his private life. In 1952, a police inquiry into a break-in at his Manchester residence forced Turing to reluctantly confess that he had been romantically involved with 19-year-old Arnold Murray. From 1885 to 1967, homosexuality was against the law in the UK, and Turing was charged with indecency. He admitted guilt and was compelled to undergo chemical castration, while also being barred from participating in any future government code-breaking projects. 2 years later, he was discovered dead from cyanide poisoning at the age of 41. Authorities concluded his death was self-inflicted. Rejected by the government and his wartime contributions still classified, Turing faded into obscurity until just recently.
Second World War codebreaker Alan Turing has been granted a posthumous royal pardon. The Prime Minister has welcomed the news, saying Alan Turing played a major role in saving this country.
Thousands of gay and bisexual men convicted of now abolished sexual offences have been posthumously pardoned. Turing's Law is named after Alan Turing.
The enactment of the so-called Alan Turing Law will mean around 49,000 men will be cleared of crimes of which they would be innocent today.
You see, Alan Turing's legacy hasn't passed. He's not a relict of the 20th century. His gift to us is our future.
This leads us to another icon of modern history. A man whose hard work proved that with strong desire, an idea can be turned into reality through faith in one's own strengths and abilities. But despite his remarkable success, his story ends with a tragic downfall. The hero of our story was born on February 24, 1955. His life didn't really turn out well from the very start. When he was young, his own mother left him and gave him up for adoption. Still, he wasn't there for long and soon had a new family. He was adopted by a married pair, Paul and Clara Jobs. They couldn't have kids of their own, so they decided to adopt another person's child and raise him as theirs. And this child, known as Steve Jobs, at just 17 years old, Steve Jobs left school after only one term, and for a year and a half, he took different classes to figure out what he wanted to study. In 1974, he joined Atari as a video game developer, where he first met Steve Wozniak. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were both working at Atari in the early 1970s. Jobs had earlier worked there as a technician, and Wozniak was employed to create hardware for Atari's arcade games. They shared an interest in electronics and computer tech. Ronald Wayne was also at Atari. He was an electrical expert and had been brought in by Atari's co-founder. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak met Ronald Wayne through their work with Atari, a company famous for making video games and home computer systems in the early era of the personal computer business. After their time at Atari, Jobs and Wozniak went on to start Apple Computer in 1976, and they asked Ronald Wayne to join them as a partner. Wayne agreed to become a co-founder of Apple, and he even designed the company's first logo and wrote the guide for the Apple iComputer. Years went by. Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ronald Wayne created Apple on April 1, 1976. The trio began the company in Jobs' family garage with the goal of making and selling personal computers. Their first product was the Apple I, a computer kit that had a motherboard, CPU, and RAM. Still, Ronald Wayne's role with Apple was short-term. He had worries about the possible money risks linked to the company, and afraid of possible debts, he chose to sell his 10% share in Apple for $800 just 12 days after becoming a co-founder. So Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak's meeting with Ronald Wayne happened while they were working together at Atari, and eventually led to Wayne's brief role with the early days of Apple Computer. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak are often seen as the key founders and main forces behind the company. Wozniak was the person behind Apple's first device, the Apple I, building the first model by hand using a wooden case. It was very different from the kind of computers we know and use today. The company's early growth was driven by the launch of the Apple II in 1977, which was the first personal computer to show color graphics. Apple II was very popular, so Apple III followed soon after. It was released in 1980 together with IBM. With each day that passed, the founders of Apple became rich. Steve Jobs became more sure that the future belonged to computers with user-friendly graphical screens. So in 1983, he introduced the Apple Lisa, the first personal computer with a graphical screen. Later, its sales turned out to be poor due to the high cost and the small number of apps. Still, it was the first consumer computer to come with a mouse, and more importantly, a GUI. Steve Wozniak also departed from Apple in 1983. So in 1984, Apple released the Macintosh 128K, which was a success. It was the first widely available consumer-priced computer and featured a GUI and mouse similar to Lisa. At $2,495, the Macintosh still wasn't affordable, but was far from the $10,000 Lisa, though its sales later dropped sharply due to the high cost, slow performance, and software limits. Neither Jobs nor Wozniak were Apple's leader when the company began. Its first CEO was Michael Scott, who joined from National Semiconductor in 1977. Mike Markkula, an early backer and Apple's third worker, replaced Scott in 1981 and led the company until 1985-1983. It was in 1983 that Jobs famously persuaded then Pepsi CEO John Sculley to become Apple's next CEO. John Sculley and Steve Jobs initially got along well, but their partnership soon soured. In 1985, Jobs planned to remove Sculley as Apple's leader in a coup. The attempt, however, failed, and Apple's board ended up moving Jobs into the role of chairman, which was far from a hands-on position. Steve left the company in 1985 and started Next with some of his staff. Jobs launched the Next Step operating system, which was later acquired by Apple for $430 million. At that moment, Apple was close to bankruptcy when Steve Jobs returned to run the company as CEO in 1997. Since then, the company's future changed. They started creating new products and in 1998 launched the iMac, which sold over 800,000 units in the first 5 months. In 2001, the first Apple stores opened in Virginia and California, and Mac OS X was launched. The portable gadget iPod hit the market, and in 2003, they introduced the first digital platform to sell music, iTunes, which quickly became the market leader. In 2007, Apple had the most successful launch in its history, the iPhone, Apple's first touchscreen phone. Thanks to the iPhone's success, Apple launched the iPad in 2010, the first tablet designed to replace a computer. Jobs was honored by being inducted into the California Hall of Fame in 2007. That same year, he was named the most powerful person in business by Fortune magazine. In 2009, Fortune also named him the CEO of the decade. The following year, he ranked number 17 on Forbes' list of the world's most powerful people. In 2010, he was named Person of the Year by the Financial Times. Sadly, in 2003, Steve Jobs, the man who seemed unstoppable, was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic neuroendocrine cancer. Despite having access to the best medical care, he delayed surgery, choosing alternative treatments, a decision many believe worsened his condition. Perhaps he thought the same intuition that guided his innovations could heal his body. But cancer doesn't wait for anyone. Even as the illness quietly advanced, Jobs kept working, unveiling products like the iPhone 4, his once vibrant figure now visibly frail, but his determination unshaken. By 2011, he could no longer fight the inevitable. He resigned as Apple's CEO, saying, "Unfortunately, that day has come." Shortly after, on October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at 56. The world lost not just a tech icon, but a man whose light faded far too soon, though his legacy continues to glow in every device he helped create. Design is not just what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works, said Steve Jobs. Apple became the first U.S. company to reach a $2 trillion valuation after his death.